If you want to know how a plant grows, it takes water, air, and sunlight and makes cellulose. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we call it photosynthesis. Unlike me and you, plants need CO2 and they make oxygen that stops us from turning blue. Every plant can do this fundamental process, and we call it photosynthesis. I actually remember the photosynthesis song from my biology class all those years ago. So, photosynthesis by Miss Hoskins. Photosynthesis has two basic stages. It can be divided into two different sets of combinations of reactions: the light dependent and the light independent. The light dependent reaction requires solar energy, like light. We call that the electron transport chain, or a light reaction, also known as the light dependent reactions. All right, a light independent reaction is a reaction that happens whether or not there's light there. So it's a synthesis reaction. It does not require any solar energy. An example of that is the Calvin cycle. So we call it, the Calvin cycle is labeled as a dark reaction, but it's really light independent. It doesn't require the solar energy. But there are reactions that are light dependent. They depend upon the light, a photon, to happen, and those are things like the electron transport chain. All right, let's talk about light dependent reactions first. So their purpose is to capture energy from the sun, right? Because the sun's only out part of the time, and store that energy in the energy carrying molecule ATP. There's also NADPH, which I'll get to in a sec. All right, so where does this happen? This happens in that grana stack, specifically those thalcaloid membranes, and that's where chlorophyll is and like where it's stored. So it happens in that organelle. The light-dependent reactions, a water molecule is split into a hydrogen and oxygen, and that oxygen is released as a waste product, and so ATP and NADPH are kind of charged up by the sun. Okay, so essentially we have like our cell membrane, and there's a chloroplast, we'll just say sitting right here. Sunlight comes down like this and strikes this chloroplast. There's water inside of the cell, and it's bumping up against right here. And when it comes in contact with it, that light energy hits that water molecule, splitting it into an oxygen and hydrogen ions. That's an H+. One of these hydrogen ions is about to be used to make NADPH. This process creates an excited electron. Energy from the sun is passed down the electron transport chain. That's a series of 4 or so protein complexes that go through this pretty complicated oxidative phosphorylation process. But it basically, the energy that it gets from the sun will be passed through a protein chain process, and after it is gone through that process, it's going to be stored, that little electron energy, in the ATP and the NADPH molecule. So again, this is a chemiosmotic process because there's this hydrogen positive hydrogen ion gradient where it's moving down a gradient to make that ATP. So ATP and NADPH and hydrogen, they all leave the light-dependent reactions and the whole protein electron transport chain complex. All right, so how does that light get absorbed? There are photosystems absorbing light, kind of buried in that phospholipid bilayer. These are clusters of chlorophyll and other proteins that trap energy from the sun. Remember, chlorophyll is a pigment that can absorb sunlight. Energy is transferred to electrons, and it makes that excited electron. So in this diagram, here we have photosystem 2. That's just its name. And the water molecule that we've been talking about. Light strikes photosystem 2, and we break apart water, and we make oxygens and hydrogens. We also release an electron. That electron will be transported over to another photosystem, photosystem 1, and it will be used to transform NADP to NADPH. So it's going to find another hydrogen and attach it to NADP, creating NADPH. And it's going to use this electron that it's made from photosystem 2. When we break up that water, creating those oxygens and that hydrogen is used in an uptake right here and becomes available. And when that hydrogen becomes available, it's going to assist turning that ADP, that adenosine diphosphate, and another phosphate will be present, and that hydrogen will aid in attaching that phosphate group back to that ADP, making ATP. So to kind of simply summarize this, we need water and we need sunlight, and through the process of making energy, we attach the hydrogen to NADP, and it assists ADP in making ATP. Molecules that carry electrons in order to pass on their energy are what we call electron carriers. So a compound, NADP plus, for example, that can accept a pair of high energy electrons and transfer them to another molecule are what we call electron carriers. So that NADP grabs and carries 2 electrons and an H plus to become NADPH. So ATP and NADPH carry energy from light dependent reactions specifically. They're going to the light independent reactions. Light dependent reactions are fascinating to me. Just how something inside of a plant cell, inside of an organelle, inside of a membrane can just trap energy from a photon moving from the sun is amazing to me. But that's what plants do. They use sunlight, carbon dioxide molecules that they take up through their stroma, water that they take up through their roots. And through this process, they pump out oxygen that we breathe and sugar that we eat. Inside every plant cell are these chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are green because they're reflecting green light and absorbing all other wavelengths of light. All right, so the chloroplast inside of it has stacks of grana and this fluid around it called stroma. And each of those stacks is a little thalcaloid plate or thalcaloid membrane. And these guys right here are also where the water is coming in and the light is coming in. And they're taking water, popping off the oxygens, and taking the hydrogens with them to go through the light-dependent reaction. These light-dependent reactions kind of stop there, but they're going to continue when nighttime comes in the light-independent reactions, known as the Calvin cycle. In the light-independent reactions, we will see how this formed NADPH and this formed ATP are taken into the Calvin cycle, and you guessed it, we're going to rip off its phosphate group and rip off its hydrogen and get energy from it, and then use carbon dioxide to make water. I'm sorry, to make sugar. So this is the other part of photosynthesis. This doesn't always happen at night. It's happening whether or not there's sunlight or not. These light-independent reactions, the Calvin cycle, is happening in this fluid next to the granite stacks called the stroma.